Hi, I'm going to go over the reading journal, The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, Acts 3 through 5 with you guys, since I've had several questions about this reading journal. First of all, I just want to direct you to SparkNotes as kind of a place to read the summary after you've read the play. And remember, the No Fear Shakespeare on SparkNotes gives you the side-by-side translation. But the Spark Notes are just kind of a summary, and so I just wanted to go over that, kind of what has happened in Acts 3 through 5 before we take a look at the reading journal. So in Acts 3, basically Tybalt challenges Romeo to a duel, and Mercutio gets in there, jumps in, decides he wants to fight. Romeo tries to stop Mercutio, and as he's holding Mercutio to get him to stop, Tybalt stabs him. So it's kind of Romeo's fault. So then Romeo gets mad and stabs Tybalt. The prince comes in, and Romeo runs away. And the prince is really mad about the brawl, obviously, right? The Montagues, which are Romeo's mom and dad, come in, and then the Capulets come in, and the Capulets demand that Romeo be put to death. The prince decides that he should be exiled to Verona, so he's going to be, or exiled from Verona, so he's not going to be able to live there anymore. Obviously, this is causing a problem because remember, Tybalt is Juliet's cousin, and Romeo just killed Juliet's cousin when they're supposed to be married already, right? So, in the Capulet house, Juliet longs for the night that she and Romeo can be together. Suddenly, the nurse rushes in and tells her about the fight between Romeo and Tybalt. The nurse is so distraught that she stumbles over her words, making it sound as if Romeo is dead. Juliet's fallen apart, and she's so upset. And then eventually the nurse tells her that Romeo will be banished, and Juliet decides that that's worse than 10,000 slain Tybalts. And so you can tell that Juliet doesn't care about the fact that her cousin has been killed. All she cares about is that Romeo's not going to be with her. Then the nurse says that she knows where Romeo is hiding, and that Romeo will be coming for her to spend their wedding night. And Romeo goes to Friar Lawrence's cell, and that's where he's been hiding. And he's overcome with grief about the prince banishing him. Let's see. Romeo falls to the floor. The nurse arrives and sees Romeo desperately asks for news of Juliet. Friar Lawrence stops him and scolds him for being unmanly because he's crying and just throwing a big fit. And he explains that Romeo has much to be grateful for. He and Juliet are both alive, and the prince might change his mind. So the friar is very rational here in trying to keep Romeo from, being a big mess. And Act 3, Scene 4, Lady Capulet, and Paris decide that Paris will marry Juliet on Thursday, and the day is Monday. So there's only a few days away. They just decide that the wedding will be held. Let's see. The next act, they tell, Romeo and Juliet have spent the night together. And as Romeo is preparing to lower himself from Juliet's window, Juliet tries to convince him to stay, like just a few more minutes. You can stay. It's all right. Just stay just a few more minutes. And Romeo doesn't want to. So as soon as he leaves, she's a big mess and she's crying. And her mom comes in. And it's odd that her mom would come in that early in the morning to talk to her. And her mom tells her that she's going to be marrying Paris on Thursday. And Juliet just will not have it. She goes crazy and she's yelling at her, and then her dad comes in and she yells at her dad and tells her that she's not going to get married. And her father threatens to disown Juliet if she refused to obey him. So after Lady Capulet and Lord Capulet walk away, Juliet asks her nurse how she might escape this predicament. The nurse advises her to go through with the marriage to Paris. At this point, Juliet decides to not let the nurse in on her secrets anymore. And so Juliet says, okay, that's a good idea. And then she hurries off to Friar Lawrence's cell. Once she gets to Friar Lawrence's cell, she talks to Friar Lawrence, and he says, go ahead and agree to marry Paris, but the night before the wedding, take this sleeping potion. Um, and Friar Lawrence gives her the sleeping potion. He also hands her a vial of poison so that just in case something goes wrong, she can take the poison, but the sleeping potion should make her look like she's dead. When Juliet and then Friar Lawrence says, I will send a messenger to Romeo in Mantua, because Romeo ran off to Mantua to hide to wait for Juliet. And I will tell him that you're going to be buried in your family's tomb, and that he needs to go and get you guys. And then you guys can run off to go live together. Your family will think that you're dead, but at least the two of you can be together. So Juliet returns home, where she finds Lady Capulet and Lord Capulet preparing for the wedding. Juliet says that she's sorry for disagreeing, and she agrees to marry Paris. Well, Capulet is so pleased that he decides to move the wedding up a day to Wednesday, which kind of throws a kink in things, because you'll see later on that that doesn't leave a whole lot of time for Friar Lawrence to get the message to Romeo. Friar Lawrence is, um, let's see, in her bedchamber. Juliet asks the nurse to let her spend the night by herself, and repeats the request to Lady Capulet when she arrives. So apparently the nurse used to sleep in the same room with Juliet, um, but they decide to leave her alone since it's the night before her wedding. She clutches that vial, and she drinks the sleeping potion. Early the next morning, the nurse comes in, and she sees that Juliet looks like she's dead, right? They feel sad, and then they decide to get ready for her funeral. So they make these arrangements to get ready for Juliet's funeral because they think she's dead. Okay, at the beginning of Act 5, Romeo's messenger gets to Romeo and tells him that Juliet has died. And then Romeo goes to the apothecary and buys some poison, and then heads off towards Juliet's tomb. At Friar Lawrence's cell, Friar John, who is the messenger, has returned and said that he was unable to get the message to Romeo that Juliet wasn't really dead. He said that there was some kind of an issue and he wasn't able to get through the town. Friar Lawrence declares that he will have to rescue Juliet from the tomb on his own. He sends another letter to Romeo to warn him about what has happened, and plans to keep Juliet in his cell until Romeo arrives. This sequence of near misses is kind of the annoying part about this act, is because it's like everything is just a little too late. Like things just go just slightly wrong. In Act 5, Scene 3, in the churchyard that night, Paris enters with a torch, and he wants to like pay tribute to his fiance's grave, right? And about that time, Romeo shows up. Romeo sees that Paris is there, but he doesn't know that it's Paris, and so he kills him. And then he goes into the tomb to find Juliet lying peacefully. He kisses her, and it's interesting that he feels that her lips are still warm, even though like a dead person's lips should be cold. And then he drinks the poison, and he drinks the whole poison, the whole thing. Juliet wakes up, and she sees that Romeo is dead next to her. She tries to drink the poison, but he's drank it all, and so there's none left for her. So she takes his dagger off of his belt, and she stabs herself. Then, about that time, Friar Lawrence gets there. And actually, Friar Lawrence gets there just right before Juliet wakes up. So Friar Lawrence gets to the cell. He sees that Juliet's still sleeping and that Romeo has died. And he's so upset he leaves the tomb. And that's when Juliet wakes up and then stabs herself. And so I don't understand why Friar Lawrence didn't just stay there until Juliet woke up. But because he left, Juliet had that opportunity to stab herself. Friar Lawrence has run off. Then pretty soon, everyone shows up at the tomb. The Capulets, the Montagues, and the prince, and everyone shows up. Friar Lawrence comes back, and he explains everything that happened. He says, he explains the whole thing and tells them what happened. And then at that point, the Montagues and the Capulets shake hands, and they agree to end their feud. because there never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. So they agree to make amends, and they're not going to fight anymore because their children have died because they fell in love and couldn't be together. So let's go ahead and take a look at the reading journal. Basically, all you have to do is find a passage from anywhere from between Act 3 and Act 5 that is explicit, and a passage that is implicit. You need to find 3 examples of each. Remember, explicit is something that is very clearly stated, and you don't have to guess at. So it's very clearly stated that Juliet decides when she drinks the potion, or when she says that she would rather have Tybalt dead 10,000 times than have Romeo banished once. It's very clear that she cares much more about Romeo than she does her own cousin. So you could use that as an example of something that's explicit. Something that's implicit is something that we as the reader have to imply. It's left for us to imply. So when Friar Lawrence, he said, when his Friar John messenger comes back and says that he wasn't able to deliver the message to Romeo, Friar Lawrence says, well, I'll have to just rescue Juliet from the tomb myself, and then I'll send another letter to Romeo, and Juliet can just wait with me until he gets back. It's clear that Friar Lawrence is not worried about Romeo finding out. So you can imply that Friar Lawrence thinks he still has everything under control. And then these are words, themes that develop throughout Acts 3 and Acts 5. So all you have to do is just find a passage and explain how that theme is developed in that passage. So obviously there's themes of love everywhere. We talked about this theme of timing and how it's interesting that they're just a few minutes too late. Like they moved the wedding forward to Wednesday, and that caused a problem because then it didn't leave as much time for planning out anything. Then the letter didn't get to Romeo, and Romeo just barely missed Friar Lawrence. If Friar Lawrence had been there just a few minutes sooner, he would have seen that Romeo was showing up at the tomb. And so then destiny, perhaps it's their destiny that they had to die in order to end the feud anyways. So just choose acts and scenes that demonstrate these themes, and then just explain how those themes are developed in that scene. As far as influences on theme, how do specific characters influence the theme? This theme of forbidden love, or the theme of time, or the theme of destiny. And just think about it. How does the plot? Because remember that turning point in Act 3 where Romeo kills Tybalt and he's banished. How does that plot influence those themes? Dialogue is conversation between characters. The language. Monologue, remember, is when one character is giving a speech to other characters. Soliloquy. And if you have to look back into Acts 1 and Acts 2 to find examples of those things, that's fine. As far as the tragedy goes, a tragedy is when, it ends in death. So the plot development that leads to death. The language that kind of develops that theme of tragedy. Any foreshadowing that hints at their future tragedy. Metaphors are comparisons without using the words like or as, so any comparisons that are going on there. The author's tone and the mood, how is it making you feel, and how does that contribute to the style of being a tragedy? And as long as you're explaining yourself in these passages and explaining why you chose the act and the scene over here, you're going to earn your full credit. So, just make sure that you're being clear here what word you've chosen. Remember how we talked about the word fester being much more powerful than the word soar. Figurative language like simile, metaphor, personification, those kind of things. And as long as you're finding an example of a powerful word, of figurative language, you may have to look up the historical setting and the cultural setting. It's set in Verona, but what's the time period that it's set, and what's the culture that it's set? And then how do these passages develop the tone? And the tone is just that, how it makes you feel, and that feeling that the author is trying to convey. And then the short answer, which character can you best relate to and why? So again, as long as you're just explaining yourself and being thorough, you'll earn all of your credit. So if you have any questions, please let me know.